a minstrel show than any other.
Down, I'm a eagle, I'm a mason, I'm a elk, I'm a knight. I'm ready for the ride.
Mr. Bones, Mr. Bones, how do you feel, Mr. Bones?
What's the matter with you boys shooting up that man's hen house?
I'll shoot any chicken trying to follow me home.
Well, why don't you get a job and go to work?
No.
I come from south, from the deep, deep south, where the fields of cotton just die with blight, and the pappy reeds esquire with his knife, while the Alabama mammy plays bridge all night.
According to Wikipedia, minstrel is an American form of entertainment consisting of comic skits, variety acts, dancing, and musical performances that depicted Black people of African descent. I don't like that definition. I don't think it's a good definition. I think that it completely overrides the fact that it was the most popular form of American theater entertainment. It was one of the first forms of American theater entertainment, and it overrides the emotional aspect of how violently it affected America and society and Black culture and representation for African Americans in the media. My own definition of minstrelsy is the most popular and earliest American form of entertainment consisting of comic skits, variety acts, dancing, and musical performances that depicted white people stereotyping Americans of African descent.
F is for Felix, who won't do no work. He's lazy and shiftless and ready to shirk.
A common character in Minstrel was the slave. A male slave was most commonly portrayed as lazy, shiftless, and someone who would do all they could to not make money honestly. This portrayal is what led to a very negative and violent depiction of Black men in the media.
What do you all mean, really?
I'll show you what I mean.
Another common character was Mammy, a Black woman servant who would tend to white children and work in the nursery. Some stand by her as a positive portrayal, when in reality she was made to be insensitive, illiterate, and create a negative stigma around older African American women. Mammy was often reprimanded for doing something incorrectly. Portrayals of African Americans in these roles created extreme stereotyping and cultural bias of people of color in society and did a great injustice to the Black community.
On the February morning, a tiny baby boy was born. Abraham.
I didn't like that. I wanted to do this project because the day that we walked in on the Rhode Historical Society, I was looking around, I was seeing what things they had, and I saw a little corner where they had a lot of scrapbooks where they were just ads for theaters. And this was not a scrapbook marked as a minstrelsy scrapbook. This was just a scrapbook marked as ads for plays that were coming to theaters in Providence. And I was looking through it, and I found that a good majority of these plays were actually minstrel shows. They were labeled as vaudeville shows, or they were labeled as comedy troupes, comedy acts, but they were all minstrel shows. And I thought that that was incredibly interesting, that even in the Rhode Island Historical Society, they don't necessarily have a section for minstrelsy and how prevalent it was in America. They simply have it mixed in with the rest of theater, which I found very interesting. And so when I was looking through it, I just saw all these pictures of blackface and depictions of animalistic depictions of African Americans, and I was just so taken aback that these were all Rhode Island-based troupes. These were all Rhode Island-based acts that would travel the country and make millions of dollars exposing African Americans as something that they are not. Many sites and sources have claimed that minstrelsy first emerged in New York City in 1848, and while I was doing my research, I found that was not necessarily true. The first major publicized minstrel show was in New York City in 1848, but before that, you found many instances in dating back as far as the 1830s in which minstrel shows were popular in other parts of America, and you can go back as far as 1843 to when minstrel shows were introduced to Providence. Providence became a big hub for minstrel shows by the 1860s. Over 10 to 15 minstrel shows would initiate their tours in Providence because it was a very big market over here for entertainment. And that is surprising to me. It was very surprising when finding out this research that Providence was sort of a hub for minstrel shows. It was equated with San Francisco and New York City in terms of how many people would go to see minstrel shows. Large-scale cities were equating the same amount of revenue from minstrel shows as Providence was at the time. After doing my research and really looking into the history of minstrelsy, I wanted to find out why it was so popular in the North and even the West Coast and places that you wouldn't necessarily think of as the most racist cities. Boston was named the most racist city in America less than 5 years ago, and the fact is that the North still is incredibly racially biased. A lot of the fact is because there are not as many black people in the North, and another fact is at the time of minstrelsy, it was really about a war between North and South. It was during the Civil War. This was a time when there was prejudice, not necessarily just even around race, there was prejudice around being from the South or prejudice around being from the North, depending on where you were in the country. So people in the North liked minstrelsy because it painted a negative depiction of slavery. And they could paint this negative depiction, but they weren't painting negative depictions of slavery through white slave owners and through selfish slave owners. They were painting a negative depiction of slavery through black people and black stereotypes. They weren't being honest about what slavery is, even when they were trying to expose slavery through minstrelsy. They were really just birthing more African American stereotypes that still are alive in this country because of minstrelsy and because of minstrel shows that started in the North. In the South, it was popular because it was a form of entertainment and it made fun of African Americans. Some of the more prevalent places in Providence and Rhode Island in general for minstrelsy were Face Theater, Providence Opera House, the Academy of Music, which its very last show was a minstrel show, and then the Phoenix building was a big building where a lot of minstrel shows would go to tour. The one that was the most interesting to me and the most fascinating was the Providence Opera House, because once I started looking into it and researching it, I found its address at the Rhode Island Historical Society of where it was. And its address is 115 Dorrance. If that sounds familiar, it's because it is. 115 Dorrance, while back in 1870 it was built as the Providence Opera House. It is now the John Center Wales Library, or the Yena Center. And that just kind of shocked me that our school was actually somehow involved in the subject of my project, and the fact that minstrelsy was so prevalent and deeply rooted in American culture at the time. Some of the more prevalent people in minstrelsy in Providence and in Rhode Island were Denman Thompson was this character created by Joshua Whitcomb, and he was a slave character, and he traveled around America and Europe doing this minstrel show, playing a character named Denman Thompson, and the place that he started out of was called Theatre Comique in Providence on Westminster. Another very big group of traveling brothers who did minstrel shows all across the country were Charles, Daniel, and Gus Frohman. Charles, Daniel, and Gus would switch back and forth between who would be playing this mammy character, who would be playing this male slave character, and then who would be playing this dapper white male character who sort of tried to teach these black people how to behave properly in white society. And then the most prevalent person, I think, in all of Rhode Island minstrelsy is this man named Charles H. Dupreez, and he invented the minstrel parade that would go down Westminster and around downtown Providence every single year starting in the early 1900s. He's also the same man who brought minstrel shows 2 Rhode Island state fairs, to the Rocky Point Fair, and he also brought the Ferris wheel with him the same year that he brought minstrel shows to Rhode Island state fairs. And people online have celebrated him as the man who brought the Ferris wheel to Rhode Island, but nobody wants to talk about how he was also the same person who really normalized and mainstreamed minstrelsy in the North. The cultural significance of minstrelsy is still alive to this day. More than ever, we're seeing news stories come out of very influential people in government and the media wearing blackface, making blatantly violent and racist comments against African Americans, and brands attempting to cash in on the symbol of blackface. This is all an effect of minstrelsy on our culture, stemming from the earliest forms of plays, which made its way to film and is still finding ways to seep into the modern era. The market made in Rhode Island history is far more significant than one would ever imagine, and we still have a long way to go in this country when it comes to media portrayals of African Americans.